The dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light of the parlor, each one a tiny, silent witness to the end of Clarabelle Wynn's world. At 28, she was a woman grown, tall and with a straightness to her spine that life had not yet managed to bend. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned in a severe but tidy bun at the nape of her neck, and her hands, though calloused from garden work and mending, were still. They rested in her lap, one over the other, a small fortress of calm in the storm of her father's making. "The matter is settled. Clarabelle." Abraham Wynn's voice was like the stones he'd used to build the foundation of their farmhouse, hard, unyielding, and set in its place for all time. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the hearth, where a low fire sputtered, fighting against the encroaching chill of the late autumn afternoon. "Mr. Abernathy is a man of considerable means. He owns the dry goods store and half the land north of the creek. He is 52, a widower with no children to complicate matters. He will provide for you. You will be a wife." Clarabelle's own voice, when it came, was quiet but not weak. "He is 52, father. His breath smells of stale tobacco. And his eyes do not see a woman. They see a broodmare and a housekeeper." "He sees a respectable match," her father snapped, his heavy shoulders tensing beneath his Sunday coat. "What more should he see? You are 28, past the age of foolish fancies and poetry. This is not about love. It is about security. It is about your duty to this family." "What duty?" The question was soft, but it sliced through the thick silence of the room. "To be sold off like the last of the season's cattle to settle a debt I did not incur." Abraham finally turned to face her. His face was a mask of grim determination, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes the color of a winter sky. There was no warmth in them. Not for her, not anymore. "Mr. Abernathy has been generous. He has offered to forgive the loan I took for the spring planting. That loan, girl, is what put food on your plate. This farm, the one you have lived on your entire life, under my roof will be secure. Your security is a consequence of that. My security is to be the property of a man I do not respect, let alone love." She stood then, her height nearly matching his. She was her mother's daughter in that, tall and with a certain grace. But her stubbornness, that was all Abraham. "I will not do it. I will not marry him." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the tick-tock of the grand clock in the hall, a sound that had measured out every minute of her life until now. "Then you are no daughter of mine," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the rage she might have expected. It was colder, more terrible than that. It was the sound of a door being bolted shut. "The life you have known is over. This roof will not shelter you. This table will not feed you. If you will not be a wife to the man I have chosen, then you will be nothing to me." He did not need to say more. Clarabelle saw the finality in his posture, in the hard set of his jaw. There was no appeal, no room for tears or argument. He had passed his sentence. She walked from the parlor, her back as straight as a fence post, and went up the stairs to the small room under the eaves that had been hers since she was a girl. She did not pack much. A change of dress, her mother's worn book of psalms, a small sewing kit, and the few dollars she had saved from selling eggs in town. It was a pittance. It was everything. When she came down, her father was gone. He had not waited to see her leave. It was a final, cutting mercy. She did not look back at the farmhouse as she walked down the long dirt lane. To look back would be to invite a weakness she could not afford. The world she had known, with its predictable seasons and its suffocating certainties, had vanished behind her. Ahead lay only the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains and a future as blank and terrifying as a starless night. The road was a hard teacher. Her money, which had seemed a small comfort, dwindled with astonishing speed. A bed in a boarding house, a loaf of bread, a bowl of thin stew, each transaction was a chipping away at her independence. She sought work, but the world had little use for a woman alone, a woman without a husband or a father to speak for her. In one town, she was offered a position as a laundress. But the proprietor's hands lingered too long when he showed her the lye soap. In another, a parson's wife looked her up and down, saw the lack of a wedding band on her finger, and declared the position of governess already filled, though Clarabelle had seen the notice posted that very morning. Days bled into weeks. The autumn air grew teeth. The wind that swept across the grasslands carried the first hints of snow, and the chill seeped into her bones, a constant companion to the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Hope, she learned, was a luxury. It was a warm fire and a full belly. She had neither. What she had was a growing, hollow dread. It was in a grimy town on the edge of the territories, a place that smelled of mud and cheap whiskey, that the offer was made. She was staying in the cheapest rooming house she could find, a place where the walls were thin and the nights were filled with the sounds of coughing and quiet despair. The landlady, a woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing, had watched Clarabelle for 2 days. She'd seen the way Clarabelle tried to make a single biscuit last until evening, the way her gaze lingered on the plates of paying customers. The woman, Mrs. Gable, cornered her near the back staircase. "You're out of funds, dearie," she said. It wasn't a question. Clarabelle simply nodded, her pride a small, flickering candle flame in a gale. "A woman like you, tall, well-made. You speak proper. You ain't from around these parts." "Mrs." Gable's eyes scanned her, not with lust, but with the dispassionate appraisal of a merchant examining livestock. "There's a way to earn a good purse, enough to get you a fresh start, a place to go where the snow don't fall so hard." Clarabelle knew with a sinking certainty what the woman was suggesting. The shame was a hot flush that crawled up her neck, but beneath it was a cold, hard kernel of pragmatism. Survival. That was the only word that mattered now. What way, she asked, her voice a dry whisper. "There's a mining town, couple days' ride from here, Coldridge, full of men with pockets full of silver and nothing to spend it on but drink and cards. Men get lonely." She let the word hang in the air. "There's a merchant, a man named Merle. He's made a wager with his friends. He's paid a handsome sum for the company of a fresh face, a lady, for one night." The words were wrapped in euphemism, but their meaning was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. Her first night, the one thing a woman was supposed to save, to treasure, to give as a sacred gift to her husband. It was to be a transaction, a purchase. Clarabelle's mind, the intelligent mind her father had grudgingly admired, began to calculate. The sum Mrs. Gable named was more money than she had ever held in her life. It was enough for a train ticket east, or west, far away from this life. It was enough for a room for the winter, for food, for a new beginning built on the ashes of her own dignity. She thought of her father's unyielding face. She thought of Mr. Abernathy's stale breath. She thought of the cold ground and the prospect of starving before the first true snow. What value did her honor have if she was dead? "I see," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He's not a bad sort. Merle misses," Gable added, sensing her consideration. "Just loud and full of himself. It's one night. You close your eyes, you think of the money, and in the morning, you're a free woman with a full purse." A free woman. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. She would be purchasing her freedom with the very thing that was supposed to define her worth. So she agreed. The decision was not made with a flicker of desire, nor a glimmer of misplaced romance. It was a surrender. It was the grim, calculated choice of a soldier on a losing battlefield, sacrificing a limb to save the body. This was not a bargain for love, or even for comfort. It was a trade for the simple, brutal act of continuing to breathe. It was for survival. The journey to Coldridge was a blur. She sat in the back of a freight wagon, the rough wooden boards jarring her with every rut in the road. The town, when they arrived, was even bleaker than she had imagined. It was a raw gash in the landscape, a temporary settlement of mud-caked streets and hastily erected timber buildings, all huddled under a vast, gray sky. The air was thick with the smell of pine smoke, wet earth, and the metallic tang of the nearby mine. This was the place where her life as Clarabelle Wynne, the farmer's daughter, would end. Tonight, she would be something else, a commodity, a purchase. Her first night was paid for, and as she was led to a small, clean room above the town's only boarding house, she felt a profound and terrifying emptiness. She was not hoping for a kind man. She was not wishing for a gentle touch. She was simply praying she could endure. The room was an exercise in bare necessity, a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a single, coarse wool blanket, a small washstand holding a porcelain basin and a pitcher of cold water, a single straight-backed chair. The window looked out not onto an open prairie, but onto the muddy, rutted alley that ran behind the boarding house, a place of discarded crates and the lingering smell of stale beer. The air in the room was thin and carried a damp chill that the small, pot-bellied stove in the corner could not entirely defeat, no matter how much kindling she fed it. Clarabelle sat on the edge of the chair, her spine perfectly straight, as if proper posture alone could ward off the encroaching reality of her situation. She had been brought here an hour past sundown by Mrs. Gable's associate, a quiet man who hadn't met her eyes. He had pointed to the door, mumbled that Mr. Merle would arrive shortly, and disappeared, leaving her in the charged silence. Now, she waited. She tried not to think. Thinking was a dangerous indulgence. It led to memories of her father's stone-cold face, to the scent of rain on the fields back home, to the crushing weight of what she was about to do. Instead, she focused on the room's imperfections, a crack in the ceiling that resembled the map of a river, a dark water stain on the floorboards near the washstand, the way the dying light caught the dust motes, turning them into a swirling galaxy of tiny, insignificant worlds. Outside, Coldridge was coming alive. The sounds of the day, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of ore carts were replaced by the raucous sounds of the night. A piano, slightly out of tune, tinkled from the saloon across the street. Bursts of loud, masculine laughter followed by the crash of a glass. Every sound seemed to magnify her isolation, her otherness. She was not a part of this world. She was an item to be used by it. She smoothed the fabric of her worn but clean dress for the 10th time. Her hands were cold, her knuckles white where she gripped them in her lap. The man, Merle, was late. A part of her, a foolish, naive part. She thought she had starved to death, began to hope he wouldn't come at all. But that hope was a poison, for if he didn't come, the arrangement was void. The money would not be paid, and she would be precisely where she was before, only in a colder, harder place, with the dawn promising nothing but another day of hunger. So she squashed the hope and replaced it with a grim, hollow resolve. Let him come. Let this be over. An hour bled into 2. The piano music from the saloon grew louder, more frantic. The stove finally gave up its last bit of warmth, and the chill in the room began to claim victory. Just as she was about to rise and add the last of her precious kindling, heavy footsteps stopped outside her door. Her heart gave a painful, violent lurch. This was it. She stood, her hands clenched at her sides, and faced the door. She composed her features into a mask of placid neutrality, a mask she hoped concealed the terror churning within her. The knock was hard and impatient. It was not the knock of a man coming for a night of pleasure. It was the knock of a man with business to conduct. "Come in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened, but the man who entered was not the portly, loud merchant Mrs. Gable had described. This man was gaunt and stoop-shouldered, with a weary face and eyes that looked as if they were constantly tallying accounts. He was Silas Croft, the owner of the boarding house, a fact she knew from the ledger he held clamped under one arm. He did not bother with pleasantries. His gaze swept the room, noted her presence, and dismissed her as part of the inventory. "There's been a complication," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. Clarabelle waited, her throat tight. "Your man, Merle," Croft continued, flipping open his ledger and running a bony finger down a column of names. "He won't be coming. Seems he took exception to the way a blacksmith was shuffling a deck of cards over at the saloon." A disagreement ensued. The blacksmith, a large fellow by the name of Olson, expressed his point of view with his fists. The sheriff expressed his by running Merle out of town on the midnight freight wagon. Clarabelle stared at him, unable to process the information. Gone. The man was gone. A wave of dizzying, disorienting relief washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was over before it had even begun. She was spared. But the look on Silas Croft's face stopped her relief cold. His expression was not one of sympathy. It was one of annoyance, of a business deal gone sour. "He left without settling his accounts," the man stated flatly, "which includes the fee for this room and the fee for your time." He closed the ledger with a sharp snap that echoed in the small room. "His credit is no good here anymore. The arrangement is null and void." He looked directly at her for the first time, and his eyes were like chips of slate. "I'm sorry, miss, but there's no charity in Coldridge. The room is needed for paying customers. You'll have to leave." "Leave?" The word was a faint echo of her shock. "But it's the middle of the night. Where am I to go?" "That is not my concern," he replied, his voice unwavering. He was not being cruel, he was simply stating a fact as he saw it. "I run a business. No fee, no room. It's the way of the world." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet, to be thrown out now, into the darkness of this rough, unfamiliar town, with not a single coin in her pocket. It was a depth of despair she hadn't known existed. The public shame of it was a hot brand on her skin. She had come here to sell her dignity for a chance at survival, and now she was left with neither. She stood frozen, speechless, as Croft held the door open, a clear, silent order to vacate. The rowdy sounds from the hall, from the world outside this small, miserable room, flooded in. And then a shadow fell across the doorway. A man stood there, his frame tall and broad enough to fill the entrance, blocking the dim, flickering light from the hall. He was not moving, just standing, taking in the scene with a quiet stillness that seemed to absorb the noise around him. He wore a heavy, worn leather coat, scuffed at the elbows and dark with age, and his hat was pushed back slightly on his head. Silas Croft turned, his annoyance sharpening. "This is a private matter. Move along." The tall man paid him no mind. His attention was not on the boarding house owner. It was on her. Clarabelle braced herself for another appraising stare, another look that would measure her worth in dollars and cents. But it never came. His eyes, the color of the sky just before a storm, met hers. They didn't linger on her figure or the worn state of her dress. They looked directly at her face, into her eyes, and in his gaze, she saw none of the judgment, the pity, or the predatory interest she had come to expect from men. She saw only a quiet, steady consideration. It was as if he were seeing past the transaction, past the shame, and was looking at the woman standing in the middle of the wreckage of her life. He saw the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. He saw the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. He saw asterisk her asterisk. The moment stretched, silent and profound. Silas Croft cleared his throat, impatient to finish his eviction. The stranger finally spoke, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the saloon and the coldness of Croft's dismissal. The words he chose were not the ones she expected. He did not ask what the trouble was. He did not ask who she was. He looked at her, held her gaze, and asked the simplest, most human question she had ever heard. Have you eaten? The question hung in the air, simple and profound. Have you eaten? For a moment, Clarabelle could not find her voice. It was a question so far removed from the cold transaction she had been steeling herself for that her mind struggled to find its footing. Her entire being had been coiled tight, prepared for a negotiation of flesh, for shame, for endurance. She was not prepared for a question about food. She was not prepared for a stranger's gaze that held no discernible trace of avarice. Silas Croft, the boarding house owner, recovered first. He saw not a moment of human connection, but an interruption. He stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Clarabelle and the stranger. A clear territorial gesture. "This is no concern of yours. Blackthorne," he said, his dry voice laced with irritation. "The lady and I were just concluding our business. She is leaving." The name Blackthorne meant nothing to Clarabelle, but it clearly carried weight with Croft. The stranger's steady gaze did not waver from her face. It was as if the proprietor was nothing more than a buzzing fly in the room. "She doesn't look like she's leaving," the man named Blackthorne said, his voice a low rumble. "She looks like she's about to be thrown to the wolves." He finally shifted his attention to Croft, and the calm in his eyes was replaced by something harder, an appraisal that made the Weasley man shrink back a step. "Merle's debt, I take it." Croft's Adam's apple bobbed. "He left town. The arrangement is void. The room must be paid for, or vacated." Blackthorne nodded slowly. A small, considered movement. He seemed to be a man who did nothing in haste. He looked past Croft, back to Clarabelle. The question in his eyes was silent this time, asterisk. "Is this right? Is this the situation, asterisk?" She gave the slightest of nods, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. It was all the confirmation he seemed to need. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair threaded with a few distinguished strands of gray at the temples. He held the hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly, a gesture that was somehow thoughtful rather than nervous. "How much does he owe?" he asked Croft, his tone now that of a man conducting a straightforward piece of business. A flicker of avarice returned to Croft's eyes. He saw a new opportunity, a chance to salvage a profit from the evening's fiasco. "Well, there was the original fee agreed upon with Mr. Merle, a premium rate, you understand, for a private arrangement, plus the cost of the room, and the inconvenience." "Just the price." "Croft," Blackthorne said, his voice cutting cleanly through the proprietor's oily preamble. There was no menace in it, but there was an absolute lack of patience for games. Croft's calculations were visible on his pinched face. He named a sum that was plainly exorbitant, a figure that made Clarabelle's stomach clench. It was a fortune, the very fortune she had been willing to trade her soul for. The hope that had flickered for a brief, insane moment was extinguished. This man, Blackthorne, was simply another buyer, a quieter, more imposing one, perhaps, but a buyer nonetheless. He was negotiating her price. The humiliation was so sharp, so complete, that she had to lock her knees to keep from swaying. Blackthorne did not flinch at the figure. He reached into the pocket of his worn leather coat and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. The clink of coins was a sound both sickening and final. He loosened the drawstring and, with a practiced motion, tipped a small pile of silver dollars and a few gold coins into his palm. He counted them out deliberately, his thumb moving over the worn faces of the metal. He placed the exact amount Croft had named onto the small, rickety table just inside the hall. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was deafening in the silence. "There," Blackthorne said. "That settles it." Croft's eyes lit up. He scurried forward and swept the coins into his hand with a miser's glee, the matter of her eviction forgotten entirely. He looked from the money to Blackthorne, a new, fawning respect on his face. "Of course. Mr. Blackthorne, the room is yours for the night. I'll leave you to it." He gave Clarabelle a quick, dismissive glance, as if she were a piece of furniture that had just been sold. And then he bustled down the hall. His purpose served. The silence that descended was heavier than before. Clarabelle stood rooted to the spot, her blood running cold. She was bought. The transaction was complete. She was the property of this quiet, intense stranger for the night. She closed her eyes for a second, gathering what little remained of her resolve. She would see this through. She had to. She opened her eyes and found him still standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He hadn't moved. He hadn't stepped into the room to claim his purchase. He was just watching her, his expression unreadable. He gestured with his head back toward the hall. "I'll ask Croft to have a tray sent up. Some stew, bread, whatever they have that's hot." His words didn't make sense. She stared at him, confused. He seemed to understand her confusion. He clarified, his voice simple and direct. "The money was for the room, and for a meal. So you have a safe place to sleep tonight and a full stomach." Clarabelle felt the world tilt on its axis. Every expectation, every fear, every grim preparation she had made was suddenly rendered meaningless. He hadn't bought her asterisk. He had bought her a room. He had bought her a meal. He had purchased her safety, not her compliance. The shock of it was a physical blow. It left her breathless. Why? Why would a man do such a thing in her experience? Men did not spend that kind of money out of simple charity. There was always a price, always an expectation. She searched his face for a sign, a hint of the catch, the hidden ledger where this debt would be recorded. She found nothing but a plain, quiet sincerity. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a saint. He was just a man who had seen another human being in trouble and had, without fanfare, offered a hand. He saw the suspicion and disbelief warring in her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh, as if he understood the world that had taught her to be this wary. "The room is yours," he repeated gently. "Alone. Lock the door after I leave. No one will bother you." He was about to turn and go. The thought of him leaving, of being left alone with this inexplicable act of kindness, spurred her to speak. Her voice, when it came out, was a raw, hoarse whisper, scraped from the depths of her soul. "I have nothing left to repay you with." It was the truest thing she had ever said. It was a confession of her absolute bankruptcy, not just of coin, but of spirit. She was empty. She had nothing to offer, nothing to give, nothing to bargain with. She was laying her destitution bare before him, testing him. Jesse Blackthorne stopped. He turned back to her fully, and for the first time, a flicker of something not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding warmed his stormy eyes. He looked at her, this tall, proud woman trying to stand straight while her world crumbled around her, and he saw not an object of charity, but a soul of immense, battered strength. He met her gaze, his own as clear and honest as a winter morning. "I'm not asking for anything to take." And with that, he placed his hat back on his head, gave her a final, brief nod, and walked away down the hall, his footsteps solid and sure on the creaking floorboards. He did not look back. Clarabelle stood in the doorway, listening until his footsteps faded away. She slowly reached out and pushed the door shut, the wood solid against her palm. She slid the bolt across, the metallic scrape a sound of final, unbelievable security. She was alone. She was safe. A few minutes later, a soft knock came. It was a boy from the kitchen, holding a tray with a steaming bowl of thick beef stew, a chunk of dark bread, and a mug of hot, bitter coffee. He set it on the floor, mumbled, "Mr. Croft's compliments," and scurried away. Clarabelle carried the tray to the small chair and sat. She stared at the food, the steam warming her face. She had come to this town to sell herself. She had been prepared for the worst the world had to offer. Instead, she had been met with a simple, quiet act of grace. It was a kindness so profound, so unexpected, that it hurt more than any cruelty could have. She picked up the spoon, her hand trembling slightly, And for the first time since she had walked away from her father's farm, Clarabelle Wynne wept. The tears were not for what she had lost, but for the one small, inexplicable thing she had just been given. Sleep did not come easily, but when it did, it was a deep and dreamless void. For the first time in weeks, Clarabelle was not sleeping with one ear open for danger, nor was she curled into a tight ball against a hunger that gnawed from the inside out. She was simply safe. The thin blanket, which had seemed so inadequate the night before, now felt like a shield. She awoke to a pale, gray light filtering through the single window. The sounds from the saloon across the street had long since died, replaced by the quiet, early morning movements of a town preparing for another day of labor. For a long moment, she lay still, allowing the events of the previous night to settle back into her mind. The humiliation of Croft's dismissal, the sudden appearance of the tall stranger, his quiet question, the clink of coins on the table, and his final, stunning words, "I'm not asking for anything to take, The act of kindness was so alien, so contrary to the brutal logic of her new world, that it felt like a dream. But the empty bowl and mug on the floor, remnants of the stew and coffee, were real. The secure bolt on the door was real. She was still here. But the new day brought with it a familiar, pressing question: what now his charity had provided for a single night. She had no reason to expect more. She was a stranger to him, a problem he had solved with a handful of coins. Today, she was back where she started, with no money and nowhere to go. A grim resignation settled over her. She would wash her face, straighten her dress, and walk out of that boarding house with her head held high, even if her next destination was the unforgiving street. She rose, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet. After washing with the icy water from the pitcher, she pinned her hair back into its customary bun, a small act of order in a life that had devolved into chaos. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the door and stepped out into the hall. The boarding house was quiet. The smell of frying bacon and weak coffee drifted up from the common room downstairs. Her stomach gave a hopeful clench, a feeling she immediately suppressed. Food was for paying customers. She was not one of them. She walked down the creaking stairs, her hand trailing on the worn, smooth banister. Her plan was to slip out the front door unnoticed, to avoid another encounter with Silas Croft. But as she reached the bottom step, she saw him. Jesse Blackthorne was sitting alone at a small table in the corner of the common room, a thick ceramic mug of coffee held in his large, capable hands. He was staring into the cup, lost in thought, the morning light catching the weathered lines around his eyes. He looked different without his hat, more grounded, his dark hair showing the first signs of a day's work already begun. He was dressed in the same practical, durable clothes as the night before. He did not look like a man of leisure. He must have sensed her presence, because he looked up. His gaze met hers across the room. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement. He gave a slight nod. "Morning," he said, his voice low and even. Clarabelle stopped, her hand still on the newel post. "Mr. Blackthorne." Her own voice was formal, a little stiff. She owed this man a debt of gratitude she could never repay, and the imbalance of it was a palpable thing between them. He took a slow sip of his coffee. "There's a storm coming, a bad one, by the look of the sky. First real snow of the season." She said nothing, unsure of what this observation had to do with her. "I have a ranch north of town," he continued, as if explaining a simple fact. "I could use a hand. The snow's already drifting up against the stable doors. The horses need to be able to get in and out. It's work, shoveling, mostly." He looked at her directly then, his gaze steady and clear. "It's hard work, but the pay is a roof over your head and 3 meals a day. For now." The offer was laid out as plainly as the wooden table he sat at. There were no hidden meanings, no flowery language. It was a practical solution to what he must have known was her practical problem. He was not offering charity. He was offering a trade, her labor for her keep. He was offering her a way to maintain her dignity, to earn her place. It was, she realized, the greatest gift he could have given her. "I'm a strong worker," she said, the words coming out with a conviction that surprised her. "I'm not afraid of hard work. Mr. Blackthorne." "Jesse," he corrected her quietly. "My name is Jesse." He gestured to the kitchen. "Get some breakfast. My wagon's out front. We'll leave when you're ready." He turned his attention back to his coffee. The conversation apparently concluded. Clarabelle stood for a moment, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. Then she walked to the counter, her back straight, and accepted the plate of eggs and bacon offered by the cook without meeting his curious eyes. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a silence that was not awkward, but full. The buckboard rattled and groaned over the frozen ruts of the road leading out of Coldridge. The sky overhead was a solid sheet of bruised purple-gray, and the wind had a sharp, biting edge that promised the snow Jesse had predicted. Clarabelle sat beside him on the hard wooden seat, her small bundle of belongings at her feet, and watched the landscape unfold. The raw, jumbled town gave way to rolling hills and sparse pine forests, all of it dusted with a preliminary layer of white. His ranch was nestled in a small valley, protected on one side by a high, rocky bluff. It was not a large or impressive place, a simple, sturdy-looking log cabin with a stone chimney trickling a thin ribbon of smoke into the gray air. A large, well-built barn that seemed to be the heart of the operation. A few corrals, their fences stark and dark against the snow. It was a place of solitude, of function over form. It felt like an extension of the man himself. He pulled the wagon up near the barn and said, "We'll start here." The work was exactly as he had described it, hard. The snow was light and powdery in some places, but in others, the wind had packed it into heavy, dense drifts against the big sliding doors of the barn. He handed her a wide-mouthed shovel, and for the rest of the day, they worked. He did not treat her like a delicate woman. He expected her to pull her weight, and she did. The repetitive motion of scooping, lifting, and tossing the snow soon warmed her. Despite the frigid air, an ache began to build in her back and shoulders. But it was a good ache, the ache of honest labor, of purpose. He worked beside her, his movements economical and powerful. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The shared rhythm of their shovels, the scrape of metal on frozen ground, the huff of their breath in the cold air. It was a form of communication in itself. He never once asked her where she came from, who her people were, or how she had ended up in that room in Coldridge. He seemed to have no interest in her past at all. He accepted her as she was in that moment, a woman who needed a place to be, and who was willing to work for it. And so, she told him nothing. Her story was a heavy, burdensome thing, and the silence he offered was a gift. Here, in the clean, cold air of his ranch, she was not the disgraced daughter, not the desperate woman selling her virtue. She was just a person, defined only by the work of her own two hands. Days settled into a new routine. She would rise before the sun, light the fire in the cabin's main room, and put coffee on to boil. He would already be out, tending to the horses. They would eat a simple breakfast of oatmeal or bacon, and then the day's work would begin. When the snow was cleared, there were other tasks: mucking out stalls, hauling hay, checking fences. She worked from dawn until her muscles screamed in protest at dusk. In the small moments of rest, she began to make the cabin her own. In a quiet, unobtrusive way, she found his neglected mending basket and, by the light of the fire in the evenings, she patched the tears in his work shirts and darned his socks. She took his laundry down to the half-frozen creek, breaking a thin layer of ice to wash the clothes in the bracingly cold water, and hung them on a line near the hearth to dry. They were small acts, unsolicited, her way of contributing beyond the heavy labor outside. One afternoon, while he was out checking on a section of fence line, she noticed his saddle draped over a stand near the door. The thick leather was scuffed and worn, but it was the sheepskin lining underneath that caught her eye. It was torn, the stitching rotten and coming away in several places. Without a second thought, she took her small sewing kit from her bundle, using a heavy needle and a length of waxed thread, her fingers numb with cold. She painstakingly stitched the lining back into place. It was not perfect work, but it was strong and would hold. She finished just as the light began to fail, and went about preparing their simple supper of beans and cornbread. Jesse returned as darkness fell, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He was covered in a fresh dusting of snow, his face ruddy from the wind. He stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat on a peg, his movements weary. He didn't mention the saddle. He didn't seem to notice it. They ate their meal in their usual comfortable silence. He made no comment on her mending, offered no words of praise for the work she did inside the cabin. His acceptance of her presence was communicated not through words, but through the simple fact that he never made her feel like a burden. That night, after she had cleaned up from their meal, she sat by the fire, her hands busy with a shirt that needed a new button. He was on the other side of the hearth, cleaning a piece of tack. She was tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was more satisfying than any rest she had ever known. When she finally rose to go to the small cot that had been set up for her in the corner of the room, she saw it. On the rough-hewn table, next to where she usually sat, was a small tin plate. On the plate lay a single apple, its red skin gleaming in the firelight. It had been carefully peeled, the skin removed in one long, continuous spiral. It was sliced into perfect, neat wedges, the core expertly cut away. Clarabelle stopped and stared at it. It was just an apple, a simple piece of fruit. But he had taken the time, he had taken out his pocket knife, and with the same deliberate care he applied to all his tasks. He had prepared it for her. He had not said, "Thank you for fixing my saddle." He hadn't said, "I appreciate the mending." He had said nothing at all. Instead, he had left her this. It was a small act, a quiet gesture, but it was an acknowledgement. It was a communication, in his own silent language, that he had noticed. He saw her. A lump formed in her throat, thick and painful. She thought of her father, whose approval always came with conditions. She thought of all the men whose eyes had held only calculation. No one had ever done something for her so simply, so freely, without wanting something in return. This small, sweet offering felt more precious than all the gold coins in Coldridge. She reached out a trembling hand and touched one of the cool, crisp slices. It was enough to make her want to cry. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life at the ranch became a quiet, steadying hum in Clarabelle's blood. The predicted storm had come and gone, blanketing the valley in a deep, pristine layer of white that softened the hard edges of the world. Her life narrowed to a series of simple, grounding tasks: the bite of the axe into firewood, the warmth of the cabin after a day in the biting cold, the scent of coffee in the pre-dawn dark, the solid weight of a shovel in her hands. The memory of the woman who had sat waiting in that boarding house room began to feel distant, like a story about someone else. She and Jesse maintained their quiet understanding. There were no wasted words between them, yet a language grew in the spaces, a shared glance across the cabin in the evening. The way he left the heaviest water bucket for her to fetch from the well because he knew she took pride in her strength. The way she made sure his coffee was hot the moment he stepped in from the barn. She learned the map of his habits, the way he stared out at the western bluff when a decision weighed on him, the slight tightening of his jaw when he was tired, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when one of the horses nudged his hand. He remained a man of deep reserves, his past an unopened book, but his present was an act of steady, unwavering respect. He never once made her feel like a trespasser or a charity case. Her work was needed, and she did it well. That was the entirety of their contract, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The quiet, however, could not last forever. The world was larger than their secluded valley. Their supplies began to run low: flour, salt, coffee, lantern oil. A trip to Coldridge was unavoidable. "We'll need to go to town tomorrow," Jesse said one evening, his voice pulling her from her focus on darning a thick wool sock. A knot of apprehension tightened in Clarabelle's stomach. The thought of returning to that muddy, chaotic street, of facing the curious eyes and the whispers, was like stepping back into a bad dream. Here, on the ranch, she was a capable worker. In Coldridge, what was she the woman Jesse Blackthorne had paid for? She simply nodded, keeping her eyes on her needlework. "I'll make a list." The next morning, they rode into town on the buckboard, the silence between them heavier than usual. The air was crisp and cold, and the snow crunched under the wagon wheels. As they neared the town, Clarabelle felt a familiar tension creep up her spine. She sat a little straighter, her hands folded tightly in her lap, composing her features into a mask of polite indifference. Coldridge looked the same, a raw collection of buildings huddled against the vast whiteness. But something felt different. As Jessie pulled the wagon to a halt in front of Abernathy's general store, she felt the eyes on them. A pair of miners, loitering on the boardwalk, stopped their conversation to watch them. A woman sweeping her stoop paused, her gaze lingering on Clarabelle. It wasn't overt hostility. It was a thick, cloying curiosity, the kind that precedes judgment. "I'll get the grain and the oil," Jessie said, seemingly oblivious to the attention. "You can get the goods from your list." He handed her a small leather pouch with a few coins in it, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a brief, startling moment. She took the pouch and slid off the wagon seat, her movements measured. Walking across the boardwalk and into the store felt like walking onto a stage. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her arrival, and the handful of customers inside, two trappers and a woman she recognized as the blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Olson, fell silent. The store owner, a portly man with a slicked-down comb-over who was not Mr. Abernathy, gave her a look that was both oily and appraising. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone implying he knew full well who she was. Clarabelle ignored the sudden chill in the room. She would not let them see her flinch. She walked to the counter, her back straight, and placed her list on the polished wood. "I need these items, please. Flour, coffee, salt, and a small sack of beans." As the storekeeper began to measure out the flour, Mrs. Olson, a large woman with a perpetually disapproving expression, sidled up to the counter, pretending to inspect a bolt of calico. "Quite a winter we're having," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the small store to hear. She wasn't speaking to Clarabelle, but asterisk at asterisk her. Hard for a man to be alone out on a ranch in this weather. Good thing a man like Jesse Blackthorne can afford to buy himself some company to keep him warm. The word struck Clarabelle like a physical blow. The insult was so bald, so crude, that it stole her breath. Asterisk buy himself some company. They spoke of her as if she were a new stove or a wool blanket. The blood rushed to her face, a hot, furious tide of shame and anger. All the hard work, all the calluses on her hands, all the honest aches in her back, they meant nothing. In their eyes, she was still just a transaction, a purchase. The storekeeper snickered. One of the trappers let out a low chuckle. Clarabelle's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She turned, her eyes flashing with a cold fire that made Mrs. Olson take a half step back. "I'm not company," she said, her voice low and shaking with a tightly controlled rage. "I work for my keep. I earn my place." "Mrs. Olson scoffed, recovering her nerve. "Oh, I'm sure you work," she said, drawing out the word with a nasty insinuation. "Same as a good mare works for her keep. A man pays the price. He gets what he paid for." The cruelty of the comparison to a horse, an animal bought and sold for its utility, was the final straw. Clarabelle opened her mouth to deliver a retort so sharp it would have stripped the hide from the woman. But at that exact moment, the bell on the door chimed again. Jesse stood there, a heavy sack of grain on one shoulder. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the sneering face of Mrs. Olson, the storekeeper's smirk, and the rigid, furious set of Clarabelle's shoulders. The store fell utterly silent. Jesse's presence had a weight to it that commanded respect, or at least a healthy dose of fear. He said nothing. He simply walked to the counter, lowered the sack of grain to the floor with a heavy thud, and looked at the storekeeper. His eyes were flat, as hard and gray as river stones. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice quiet. The storekeeper's smirk vanished. "No, sir, Mr. Blackthorne. No problem at all. Just town talk." Jesse's gaze shifted to Mrs. Olson, who suddenly found the pattern on the calico fabric intensely fascinating. He held her in his sights for a long, uncomfortable moment before turning his attention to Clarabelle. He saw the fury in her eyes, the two bright spots of color high on her cheeks, the way her whole body trembled with indignation. He reached out and placed his hand on the small of her back. It was not a possessive gesture, nor was it intimate. It was solid, grounding, a silent message asterisk. "I am here." He looked at the half-filled sacks on the counter. "Is that everything?" he asked her, his voice still calm. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He paid the storekeeper, his movements unhurried. He gathered their supplies, and with his hand still resting lightly on her back, he guided her out of the store and back into the cold, clean air. The wagon ride back to the ranch was a long, suffocating silence. Clarabelle stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched, replaying the scene in her mind. The humiliation burned in her gut like acid. She felt tainted, as if the town's ugly words had thrown a layer of filth over the clean, simple life she had started to build. Her anger was a wild thing, thrashing inside her, and some of it was, irrationally, aimed at the silent man beside her. He was the reason she was in this position. His quiet kindness had led to this public shame. When the ranch finally came into view, she could bear the silence no longer. "They think you bought me," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. "Like a horse, like a sack of flour." Jesse kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white where he held the reins. "What people in town think is their own business. It's got about as much substance as smoke." "It's my name they're turning to mud," she shot back, turning to face him. "My reputation. I have nothing else left, and they are taking that too." He finally pulled the horses to a stop just before the cabin. He turned on the seat to face her, and his expression was serious. The lines around his eyes etched deep with a gravity she had never seen before. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the anger in her chest faltered under the weight of his steady gaze. "I know what they're saying," he said, his voice low, "and I know it's not the truth." He paused, choosing his words with the same care he used to mend a broken harness. "You work harder than any man I've ever hired. You've earned your place here 10 times over. What happened in that boarding house? That was about survival. It's got nothing to do with the woman you are." His defense of her was so simple, so absolute, that it disarmed her, but the shame still lingered. "But they don't see that," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "They will always see me as the woman who was paid for." He held her gaze. "Then you tell them the truth," he said. His voice was soft, but the words carried the weight of a solemn vow. "If anyone asks, Clarabelle, you can tell them I didn't buy you." He looked out towards the snow-covered valley, then back at her, his eyes holding a sincerity so profound it made her heart ache. "You can tell them I'm just keeping you, like you're something precious." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Asterisk, precious, asterisk. She flinched, not from pain, but from the sheer, stunning impact of it. No one had ever used such a word for her. Her father had called her dutiful, stubborn, a responsibility. Mr. Abernathy had seen her as a fixture, a possession. The men she had encountered on the road had seen her as an opportunity or an object. Even she had come to see herself as a commodity, a thing to be bartered. But Jesse Blackthorne, this quiet, solitary man, looked at her and saw something of value, not for what she could do, not for what she could provide, but for what she was something to be kept safe, something worthy, something precious. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a cold path down her cheek. She turned her head away quickly, ashamed of the sudden show of emotion, but the word remained, echoing in the quiet space of her soul. It was a single, flickering candle flame lit in a room that had been dark for a very, very long time. The word *precious*, settled into the quiet corners of Clarabelle's heart and took root. It was a fragile seed in a patch of soil that had long been barren, but in the weeks that followed, nourished by the steady, unspoken respect in Jesse's gaze, it began to grow. The harshness of the winter was no match for the slow-blooming warmth inside her. She no longer felt like a refugee, but a resident. The cabin, with its scent of wood smoke and coffee, began to feel like home. The ache in her muscles at the end of the day was no longer a reminder of her desperation, but a testament to her strength. Life was pared down to its essentials: hard work, shared meals, and the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for constant talk. The town of Coldridge, with its gossip and judgment, faded into a distant hum, a place on a map they had to visit but where they did not have to live. It was on one of these necessary trips, a month after their last visit, that the past came roaring back. The day was deceptively bright. The sun, though weak, cast a brilliant glare off the snow, and the air was so cold and still that it felt like the world was holding its breath. They needed to purchase a new axe head and some salted pork to see them through the deepest part of the winter. As they rode into town, Clarabelle felt a familiar unease, but it was blunted now by a newfound confidence. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She knew her own worth. A truth Jesse had given her not with flowery compliments, but with a peeled apple and a quiet declaration. Jesse pulled the buckboard up in front of the blacksmith's shop. The clang of the hammer on the anvil was a loud, rhythmic heartbeat in the cold air. The blacksmith, Olson, the husband of the woman who had insulted her, was a mountain of a man who grunted a greeting at Jesse and ignored Clarabelle completely. "I'll see to the axe head." Jesse said to her, "The dry goods store is just there. You can get the pork." She nodded, taking the small pouch of coins he offered. She walked across the street, her boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. She was aware of the eyes on her, as always, but she kept her chin high and her back straight. She was no longer a victim of their scrutiny. She was simply a woman about her business. As she pushed open the door to the general store, a blast of warm, spice-scented air greeted her. She was halfway to the counter when she heard a voice that turned her blood to ice. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. If it ain't the high and mighty runaway." She froze, her hand still on the door. Standing near the stove, warming his backside, was a man she had only ever seen in her nightmares. He was just as Mrs. Gable had described him: portly and loud, with a florid face and small, piggish eyes that were currently fixed on her with a mixture of anger and smug possession. It was Merle. The store, which had been buzzing with the low chatter of a few customers, fell silent. Everyone turned to look. Clarabelle felt a hot, sickening wave of shame wash over her, so powerful it threatened to pull her under. All the progress she had made, all the dignity she had so carefully rebuilt, felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. Merle pushed himself away from the stove and took a swaggering step toward her. He was smiling, a greasy, unpleasant expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you taken up with that quiet sodbuster Blackthorne. Funny. I don't recall transferring the bill of sale. I paid good money for a night with you, girl, and I aimed to get what I paid for." His voice was loud, carrying through the small store. Designed for a public audience, he was not just confronting her, he was performing. He was reasserting his claim, putting her back in what he saw as her place. Clarabelle couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was trapped in the glare of his eyes. In the suffocating silence of the onlookers, she was back in that room. A commodity. A piece of merchandise with a price tag. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally managed to say, her voice a thin, reedy thing she hardly recognized. Merle laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "Oh, don't you play coy with me. You owe me. And since I'm feeling generous, I'll give your new keeper a choice. He can pay me back the money I spent, with interest for my trouble. Or he can hand you over. A deal's a deal." Just then, the bell above the door chimed. Jesse stepped inside. His new axe head held in one hand, he stopped dead, his eyes taking in the scene in an instant. Merle's aggressive posture, the fear on Clarabelle's face, the avid, watching eyes of the other customers. A dangerous stillness fell over him. He set the axe head down on a nearby barrel with a soft, deliberate thud. Merle turned, his chest puffed out. "Ah, Blackthorn. Just the man. We were just discussing my property. Seems you've had her on loan. The loan's come due." Jesse's gaze was fixed on Merle, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He didn't rise to the bait. He didn't speak. He simply walked forward, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that was far more menacing than any angry outburst. He stopped directly in front of Clarabelle, placing himself between her and Merle, a solid, living shield. "Clarabelle," he said, his back to Merle, his voice low and calm, meant only for her. "Go wait in the wagon." "She ain't going nowhere," Merle blustered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He took a step forward, reaching out a hand to grab her arm. "Come on, girl. Our business ain't—" He never finished the sentence. Jesse moved with a speed that was shocking in a man so large and deliberate. It was not a wild swing of anger. It was a precise, economical movement. His left hand shot out and clamped down on Merle's outstretched wrist, stopping it cold. His right fist followed, a short, brutal arc that connected with Merle's jaw with a sickening crack. Merle's eyes went wide with surprise, and then they rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the floorboards like a discarded sack, landing in a heap by the pickle barrel. He was out cold. The entire store was frozen in stunned silence. The blacksmith, Olson, who had just come in to see what the commotion was about, stood with his mouth agape. Jesse stood over the unconscious form for a moment, his chest rising and falling with a single, deep breath. He flexed the fingers of his right hand, not looking at Merle, but at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. The town had expected a barroom brawl, a messy, protracted fight. Jesse had given them a conclusion, but he wasn't finished. The greatest threat had not been Merle's hand, but his words. The poison was not the man himself, but the idea he represented that a woman could be bought and sold. Slowly, Jesse turned. He did not look at Clarabelle. He looked at the faces of the people watching them. He looked at the storekeeper, at Mrs. Olson, at the miners and the trappers. He looked at the entire town of Coldridge, gathered in that one small room, and he made them his audience. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was not filled with rage. It was the quiet, clear voice of a man stating an undeniable truth, a truth as solid and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded them. "There seems to be some confusion in this town," he began, his gaze sweeping over each and every one of them, pinning them in place. "So, let me make this plain." He paused, letting the weight of the silence build. "You see this woman?" He gestured with his head toward Clarabelle, who stood behind him, trembling. "You look at her, and some of you see a bargain, a transaction. You think a handful of silver gives a man a claim? You are wrong." He took a step toward them, and the crowd instinctively shrank back. "No one buys a woman like her," he said, the words ringing with absolute conviction. "Not for the first time, not for the last time." He looked directly at Olson, then at his wife, then at the storekeeper, making sure they understood that this was for them. For all of them. Not ever. He let the final word hang in the air. A verdict and a vow. He had not just defended her honor, he had declared it inviolable. He had not just won a fight, he had won an argument on behalf of her very soul. Without another glance at the man on the floor or the stunned onlookers, he turned back to Clarabelle. He gently took her elbow, his touch a stark contrast to the violence of a moment before. "Let's go home," he said softly. He led her out of the store, picked up his axe head from the barrel, and helped her onto the seat of the buckboard. He climbed up beside her and, with a flick of the reins, set the horses in motion. They rode out of Coldridge, leaving the whispers, the judgment, and the unconscious form of Merle behind them. The silence in the wagon was absolute, but this time it was not filled with anger or shame. It was filled with the resonant, earth-shattering echo of his words. Not ever. The ride home was a journey through a landscape of profound silence. The only sounds were the crunch of the horses' hooves on the snow, the soft creak of the wagon harness, and the whisper of the wind through the bare branches of the pines. It was not the comfortable, working silence they usually shared. This was a silence born of shock and consequence, a space where unspoken things swelled to fill the vast, cold air. Clarabelle sat ramrod straight on the buckboard seat, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She stared unseeingly at the horizon, her mind a maelstrom. She replayed the scene in the store over and over, the greasy smirk on Merle's face, the avid eyes of the townspeople, the sickening feeling of being stripped bare, of having her worth debated like the price of a bushel of corn. And then, cutting through the humiliation, was the memory of Jesse, the shocking speed of his movement, the hard final crack of his fist against Merle's jaw. But it was his words that echoed the loudest, circling and circling in her mind until they were imprinted there. Asterisk. No one buys a woman like her. Not ever. Asterisk. He had not defended his own honor, which Merle had insulted. He had not defended his property, which Merle had claimed. He had defended her asterisk. He had drawn a line in the dirt of that general store, not for himself, but for her soul, and dared the world to cross it. The ferocity of it, the sheer, unconditional totality of his defense, was terrifying and beautiful and utterly bewildering. Jesse, for his part, seemed carved from stone. His gaze was fixed on the path ahead, his jaw set in a hard line. The hand that had struck Merle now held the reins with a steady, gentle grip, a contradiction that seemed to define the very nature of the man. He did not speak, did not offer comfort or explanation. He simply drove, his presence beside her a solid, unshakable fact in a world that had just been torn apart and reassembled. When they finally reached the sanctuary of the valley, the familiar sight of the cabin and barn was a balm. The routine of evening chores was a welcome anchor in the emotional storm. They worked without speaking, unhitching the team, rubbing down the horses, their movements synchronized by weeks of practice. The familiar, mundane tasks were a way of finding their footing again, of sweeping away the ugliness of the town and returning to the clean, honest reality of the ranch. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the banked fire was a welcome relief from the biting cold. Clarabelle moved automatically, adding logs to the hearth, fetching water, slicing the salted pork they had managed to purchase. Jesse sat at the table, cleaning his knife with a piece of oilcloth, his movements slow and deliberate. The air between them was thick with everything that had happened, everything that remained unsaid. They ate their meal in the flickering firelight, the silence stretching taut. It was no longer a comfortable quiet, but a charged one. Clarabelle could feel a question building inside her, A question that had been there since the first night she had met him, but which now, after today, had become an urgent, desperate need. She had to understand. After the meal, she washed the tin plates and set them to dry. Jesse remained at the table, staring into the flames, his big shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to run deeper than mere physical exhaustion. The fight, she realized, had taken a toll on him. Too, violence was not his natural language, and he had been forced to speak it on her behalf. She could bear it no longer. She dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Jesse." He looked up, his gray eyes shadowed in the firelight. She took a breath, gathering all her courage. Why, the word was small, inadequate, but it held the weight of everything. "Why did you do that, not just today, from the very beginning, that first night in the boarding house? Why did you help me?" He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze so direct, so searching, that she felt he was seeing all the way down to the foundations of her soul. He did not answer immediately. He seemed to be weighing his words, seeking a truth that was as simple and unvarnished as he was. "Because of the woman I saw that first night," he said finally, his voice a low, rough thing, full of gravel and sincerity. "And the woman I've seen every day since." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the rough-hewn table. "When I saw you in that room, with Croft trying to throw you out, I saw a woman who had been pushed to the very edge of the world. I saw fear in your eyes. Yes, and exhaustion. But I didn't see a woman who was broken. Your back was still straight. Your chin was still up. You were ready to walk out into the night with nothing, but you were not going to crawl." He looked down at his own hands, then back up at her. "I've seen you out here, in the cold that would make most men quit. I've seen you work until you were ready to drop, and you never complained. Not once. Today, in that store. I saw them try to push you down again, try to put a price tag on you, and I saw the fight in your eyes before I ever threw a punch." He fell silent, the fire crackling in the hearth, filling the space between his words. Clarabelle stood motionless, mesmerized, her own breath caught in her throat. "You get up, Clarabelle," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming intensely personal. "Every time the world knocks you down, you get right back up. A person like that, they're worth something." He paused, and the words that came next were the ones that would change everything. They were the answer to the question she had been too afraid to ask her whole life. "You deserve good things, not because of what you can give somebody, not for the work you do or the meals you cook." He looked her square in the eye, and the world seemed to stop on its axis. "You deserve them just for being who you are, just for existing." The words were a key turning a lock deep inside her that she hadn't even known was there. The idea that her worth was not conditional, not something to be earned or paid for, but something inherent and absolute, was so revolutionary it made her dizzy. It was a truth so pure and powerful, it shattered the last of the walls she had built around her heart. Her father had demanded she earn her keep through obedience. The world had demanded she pay her way with her body or her labor. She herself had believed her value was something to be bartered. Jesse was telling her she was wrong. He was telling her that her very existence was enough. The strength went out of her legs. A wave of emotion so profound it was almost painful washed over her. It was gratitude. It was relief. It was a sorrow for the woman who had never known this simple truth. And it was a burgeoning, terrifying tenderness for the man who had just given it to her. Without conscious thought, she moved. She crossed the small space between them and sank onto the bench beside him, her body needing to be near the source of this incredible, grounding warmth. He did not move, did not flinch away. He sat as still as the mountains. A quiet, solid presence. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned into him. She rested her head against the solid wall of his shoulder, the rough wool of his shirt, a comforting friction against her cheek. She closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of wood smoke, leather, and the clean, cold night that clung to him. He remained still for a moment, and then she felt the tension in his shoulders ease. He accepted her weight, letting her rest against him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They sat there for a long time as the fire burned down to glowing embers. No more words were needed. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, a silent audience to their quiet communion. The cabin was warm against the vast, cold winter outside. But for the first time in her life, Clarabelle felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the heat of a shared hearth, the profound comfort of a shared silence. It was the feeling of being, at long last, truly safe. It was the warmth of a man who stayed. The firelight no longer seemed to just hold back the darkness. It now illuminated a shared space. In the weeks that followed the confrontation in town, the unspoken architecture of the relationship between Clarabelle and Jesse shifted. The foundations had been laid in necessity and respect. But now, something more delicate and profound was being built in the quiet moments. They still worked from dawn until the last light failed, the harsh demands of a winter ranch leaving little room for idleness. But a new awareness hummed between them. When their hands brushed as he passed her a tool, a current lingered. When their eyes met across the supper table, the glance held for a fraction of a second longer. The silence was no longer just comfortable. It was intimate, a vessel that held all the things they did not need to say. One evening, as she sat mending one of his shirts, she watched him by the fire. He was carving a small piece of scrap wood with his pocket knife, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. The shavings fell in soft curls onto the hearthstone. He was completely absorbed, his brow furrowed in concentration. In that moment, he was not her rescuer or her employer. He was just Jesse, a quiet man who had looked at the wreckage of her life and seen not a burden, but a person worth helping. A deep, aching tenderness bloomed in her chest, a feeling so potent and unfamiliar that it was almost painful. It was a feeling she had never associated with a man before. It felt dangerously like hope. Their isolation was a key ingredient to this fragile peace. The ranch was a world unto itself, governed by the seasons and the needs of the animals, not the petty judgments of men, but the world, as she was about to be reminded, had a long reach. The intrusion came on a fiercely cold afternoon, when the sun was a pale, distant coin in a steel-gray sky. A rider appeared, a dark figure moving slowly against the vast, white landscape. It was a rare enough sight to make them both stop what they were doing. Jesse, who had been splitting logs, rested his axe and watched the rider approach. His eyes narrowed. It was Silas Croft, a neighboring rancher from a few miles down the valley. A different Croft from the boarding house owner, but just as lean and weathered by the wind. He was not a frequent visitor. "Jesse," the man grunted by way of greeting, swinging down from his horse, his breath plumed in the frigid air. "Just came from town. The mail rider got through. He had this, said it was for a Clarabelle Wynne, in the care of Jesse Blackthorne." He pulled a folded, slightly crumpled letter from the inside of his coat. Clarabelle felt her heart stop. The world seemed to shrink, the vast snowy valley suddenly contracting to the small, square shape of that envelope. No one knew she was here. No one except... Her hands trembled as she reached out and took it. She knew the handwriting instantly. It was her father's. The script was as rigid and unyielding as the man himself. For a moment, she could not breathe. It was a ghost from a life she had buried, a life that had no place here in this quiet valley. "Obliged. Silas," Jesse said, his voice steady, though his eyes were fixed on her face, noting her pallor, the sudden tremor in her hands. He engaged the neighbor in some mundane talk about cattle prices and the depth of the snowpack, a deliberate and kind act of giving her a moment to collect herself. Clarabelle turned away, her back to the men, and broke the wax seal with her thumbnail. The paper was cold to the touch. The message was brutally short, devoid of any warmth or preamble. Asterisk Clarabelle, asterisk. Asterisk, your mother has taken ill with a lung fever. The doctor is not optimistic. She has been asking for you. It is your duty as a daughter to return home at once. Asterisk Abraham Wynne. The words swam before her eyes. Asterisk, your mother has taken ill. The cold that seeped into her bones had nothing to do with the winter air. She thought of her mother, a quiet, gentle woman who had long ago been worn down to a whisper by her husband's iron will. She remembered her mother's hands, always busy, always kind. The thought of her lying in that dark farmhouse, struggling for breath, was a knife twisting in her gut. Asterisk, she has been asking for you. But beneath the wave of grief and guilt was a cold, suspicious current. Her father had never been a man to admit a need. He had cast her out, declared her no daughter of his. Why this summons now? Was it a trick? A way to lure her back into his control? To force her into the marriage with Mr. Abernathy? The letter was a command, not a request. Asterisk, it is your duty. That was the language of her father, the language of ownership. She stood frozen, the letter clutched in her hand, caught in a brutal tug of war between love for her mother and a deep, instinctual fear of her father. To go back was to walk willingly into the prison from which she had just escaped. It was to abandon this fragile new life, this place where she was not an object of duty, but a person of worth. It was to leave Jessie. By the time Silas Croft had ridden off, a decision had not formed. There was only a great, churning chaos inside her. Jessie came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the solid warmth of his presence. Bad news, he asked quietly. She couldn't speak. She simply handed him the letter. She watched his face as he read it, saw his jaw tighten, saw a flicker of something hard and protective in his eyes. He read it twice, then folded it carefully and handed it back to her. Your father, he stated. It wasn't a question. She nodded, her throat thick. My mother, she is not a strong woman. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the mournful sigh of the wind. That night was the longest of Clarabelle's life. She lay on her cot, staring into the darkness, the words of the letter burning behind her eyelids. She was torn in two. One half of her screamed to saddle a horse and ride, to fly to her mother's bedside, to offer what comfort she could. The other half whispered a warning, telling her it was a trap, that to return was to surrender, to lose everything she had just found. She thought of Jessie, sleeping just a few feet away, of his quiet strength, of the way he looked at her as if she were something precious. The thought of never seeing him again was a physical ache, a hollowness that echoed the hunger she had felt on the road. The next morning, the tension in the cabin was a palpable thing. Jessie was even quieter than usual, his movements deliberate as he prepared the coffee. He did not ask her what she planned to do. He did not offer advice. He simply watched her, his gaze heavy with a silent understanding of the battle raging within her. He was giving her the space to fight it alone. She could not eat. She paced the small cabin, from the hearth to the window and back again, her mind a frantic, repeating loop of duty and fear. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She stopped in the middle of the room, her hands clenched at her sides. I don't know what to do, she whispered to the quiet room. Jessie, who was mending a piece of tack by the fire, set down his work. He looked at her, his expression serious, his eyes holding the profound respect that had been her salvation. What do you want to do? Clarabelle, he asked, his voice gentle. I have a duty to my mother, she stammered, the words tasting like ash. She is sick. She needs me. And what about your duty to yourself, he countered, his voice still soft, but with an underlying current of steel. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley that had become their world. Your father's letter speaks of duty. That's a heavy word. People use it to tie you up, to make you do things you wouldn't choose for yourself. It's a debt he says you owe. He turned back to face her, his gaze intense. You don't owe him anything. You don't owe me anything. The only person you owe is the woman who gets up every morning and faces the world. The one who survived on her own, who works until her hands are raw, who stood up to a room full of gawking fools. He took a step closer, and his presence filled the small space between them. He was not crowding her. He was offering her an anchor. I won't tell you to stay, and I won't tell you to go. That's not my place. This has to be your choice, entirely yours. He paused, and his next words were the most liberating she had ever heard, a key that unlocked the final shackle on her soul. If you go, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, go because you want to see your mother. Go because your heart tells you it's the right thing for you. But don't you dare go because you think you owe anyone a single thing. His words sliced through the fog of her confusion. He was right. This was not about her father's command. It was not about fulfilling a role that had been forced upon her. It was about her. What did Clarabelle Wynne, truly want? She wanted to see her mother. She needed to look into her eyes and know the truth. She needed to face her past, not as the runaway daughter, but as the woman she had become, a woman who was strong, independent, and who knew her own worth. She had to go, not because she was being summoned, but because she was choosing to answer. I have to go, she said, and this time, the words were not a lament. They were a statement of fact, of her own will. I have to see her. Jesse simply nodded, his expression revealing nothing of the turmoil that must have been inside him. There was only acceptance. Then I'll hitch the wagon, he said. The preparation for her departure was a quiet, somber affair. Jesse hitched a single horse to the small buckboard wagon, its frame seeming frail and inadequate for the journey ahead. He packed a heavy wool blanket, a small sack of dried jerky, and a canteen of water. When he was done, he pressed a leather pouch into her hand. It was heavy with coins, far more than she would need for the stagecoach fare. For the road, he said, his voice low, in case of delays. It's too much, she protested, trying to hand it back. He simply closed her fingers over the pouch, his own hand warm and rough against hers for a brief moment. You take what you need. You bring back what you don't. The simple assumption in his words, bring back was a small, warm coal in the cold pit of her stomach. He was not saying goodbye. He was sending her on a journey. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her small bundle of belongings beside her. He stood by the horse's head, his hand resting on its bridle. They looked at each other across the frozen air, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them. There were no promises, no declarations. There was only the stark, painful reality of her leaving and the fragile, unvoiced hope of her return. Jessie, she began, but the words caught in her throat. Thank you. Be safe. Wait for me. They were all there, but none seemed adequate. He just nodded, as if he understood it all. The trail is clear to the main road, he said. All practicality. Just keep the sun on your left shoulder. And then he stepped back. He did not watch her go. He turned and walked toward the barn, his broad back a testament to his resolve to let her go freely, without the weight of his own need tethering her to him. The act was both the kindest and the hardest thing he could have done. The journey was a long, cold blur. The stagecoach was crowded and smelled of damp wool and stale tobacco, with every mile that carried her east, away from the ranch and toward her past. The sense of dread grew. The freedom she had found in the vast, snowy valley felt like a distant dream, and the suffocating world of her father's house loomed larger with each turn of the wheels. She was no longer running from him, she told herself. She was walking toward her mother, but the distinction felt perilously thin. When she finally arrived at the lane leading to the Wynne farm, the place felt both achingly familiar and utterly foreign. It was the landscape of her childhood, but she was seeing it with new eyes. She saw not a home, but a place of rigid lines and suppressed life. The fences were perfectly mended, the barn was freshly painted, but there was no joy in its order, only a grim, joyless efficiency. Her father met her at the door. He was a wall of stern, black-clad judgment. There was no warmth in his eyes, no relief, only a grim satisfaction. "So, you have come," he said. It was not a welcome. It was an acknowledgement of her surrender. "I came to see Mother," Clarabelle said, her voice steady. She would not be the timid daughter he remembered. She stepped past him into the house. The parlor was as she remembered it, dark, heavy, and silent. Her mother was sitting in a chair by the cold hearth, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders. She was pale and frail, her breath a shallow whisper in her chest, but she was not. Clarabelle saw with a pang of both relief and anger, at death's door. The illness in her was a deeper, older thing, a weariness of the soul, a slow fading from a life lived without light. "Clarabelle," her mother whispered, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out a trembling hand. Clarabelle knelt by her chair, taking the cool, fragile hand in her own. All her anger at her father's manipulation dissolved in a wave of love and sorrow for this gentle woman. They spoke for an hour, of small, simple things. Her mother did not ask where she had been or how she had survived. It was as if the questions were too large, too dangerous for the small, quiet space she inhabited. Her father waited until her mother had been helped back to her bed. Then he cornered Clarabelle in the parlor, his purpose finally revealed. "Your mother will rest easier knowing your future is secure," he began, his voice taking on the tone of a man closing a business deal. "Mr. Abernathy has been exceedingly patient. He is prepared to forget your foolishness. The wedding can be arranged by the end of the week." Clarabelle looked at him, at his unyielding face, and felt not fear, but a profound and weary pity. He truly did not see her. He saw only a problem to be solved, a duty to be fulfilled. "No, Father," she said, her voice quiet but as firm as the winter ground. His eyes narrowed. "Do not begin that again, girl. You are home now. You will do as you are told." "I came to see my mother," she repeated, standing to her full height. She was no longer the girl who could be cowed by his anger. "I did not come home. This is your house, but it is not my home. My life is my own now." "You have no life," he thundered. "You have nothing. Only the charity of some backwoods rancher who has no doubt taken his payment from you in other ways." The insult was meant to break her, to shame her back into submission, but his words had no power over her anymore. Jesse's words were the ones that echoed in her soul. Asterisk, you deserve them just for being who you are. "What I have," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that stunned him into silence, "is a life I have earned. I am not for sale. I am not a debt to be paid. I will not marry Mr. Abernathy. Not this week, not ever." She saw it in his eyes, then the dawning realization that he had lost, the tool of duty, of shame, of paternal authority. It was broken. She was no longer a piece on his board. She was her own person. She went to her mother's room to say goodbye. "Be well, Mama," she whispered, kissing the soft, wrinkled cheek. Her mother simply squeezed her hand, a flicker of something pride, understanding in her tired eyes. Clarabelle walked out of that house without looking back. She did not feel like she was running away. She felt like she was finally, truly, walking toward home. The journey back was fueled by a fierce, desperate urgency. 2 days. It had been 2 full days. What if he thought she wasn't coming back? What if he had decided the trouble she brought was not worth the effort? The doubts gnawed at her, but beneath them was a stronger current, a deep, abiding faith in the man who had told her to go. Not because she owed it to anyone, but because she chose to. When the buckboard finally crested the rise overlooking the valley, she saw it. The cabin stood solid and real against the snow, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Hope, so sharp and bright it was painful, surged through her. She urged the horse on, her heart pounding in time with its hooves. As she drew closer, she saw him. He was by the woodpile, his back to her, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. He was working. He was simply living, a constant, steady point in a spinning world. He must have heard the wagon, because he stopped, his axe buried in a half-split log. He turned slowly. He watched her approach, his face unreadable, his body perfectly still. He did not smile. He did not run to her. He just watched, his presence a question mark against the vast, white canvas of the landscape. She pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, her legs unsteady. The silence was absolute, broken only by the huff of the horse's breath. She stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with 1,000 unspoken questions. She could have run to him, thrown herself into his arms. She could have poured out the entire story of her father's deceit, of her mother's quiet sadness, of her own final, triumphant declaration of freedom. But she did none of those things. Words were not their language. Instead, she gave him a single, long look, trying to pour all of her gratitude, all of her relief, all of her choice into that one glance. Then, she turned and walked past him, her boots sinking into the familiar path to the cabin door. She pushed it open. The warmth of the room enveloped her. The smell of wood smoke and coffee, a welcome she had only dreamed of for the past 2 days. Her eyes scanned the small, familiar space. And then she saw it. Hanging on its peg by the stove was her apron. He hadn't moved it. He had left it there. A quiet, patient testament to the space she had earned. A place held open for her, should she choose to return and claim it. With a sense of purpose so profound it felt like a sacrament. She walked to the stove. She took the apron from its peg. She untied the strings and wrapped it around her waist. The simple, domestic act, a declaration more powerful than any speech. She tied the bow firmly at her back. She did not need to look behind her to know that he had followed. She could feel him standing in the doorway, his large frame filling the entrance, bringing the cold, clean air of the outside world with him. She knew he was watching her. She turned to the half-empty sack of flour on the shelf. She took out the wooden bowl and the sifter. Her hands, steady now, began to measure out the ingredients for their supper. She had not asked for permission. She had not waited for an invitation. She had come back and taken up her life, not where it had left off, but where it was always meant to be. She could feel his gaze on her, and she knew, without even looking, what she would see in his eyes. It would be the same look from the very first night, not the look of a man who possessed something, or a man who demanded something. It was just the look of a man who was there. His presence was his answer. He was home, and now, so was she. The passing of the final, hard frost of winter felt like a collective exhale from the land itself. The iron-hard ground began to soften, and the snow, which had for months been a stark, defining feature of their world, receded in slow, uneven patches, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The season was turning, and with it, something in the air of the small cabin turned, too. Clarabelle's return had not been a dramatic event followed by grand declarations. It had been a quiet settling, a rightness that clicked into place like a well-made latch. The story of her journey, of her father's cold manipulation and her final, quiet defiance, was told in the evenings, not as a breathless drama, but as a simple recounting of facts. Jesse listened without interruption, his face a study in shadows by the firelight, his occasional, quiet nod the only encouragement she needed. He did not offer pity or praise. He offered something far more valuable. He bore witness. He heard her story, and in his listening, validated her truth. Their life together found a new, deeper rhythm. The shared work was the same, but it was now underscored by a shared certainty. She was there because she had chosen to be. He was there because he had never wanted her to be anywhere else. It was a truth that lived in the way he now looked for her glance before making a decision about the day's work, in the way she began to hum softly to herself as she kneaded bread. A sound of contentment that was as new to her as the feeling itself. Spring arrived not in a rush, but in a series of gentle, tentative gestures. The relentless wind softened, and, one afternoon, it carried not the bite of ice, but the scent of damp soil and melting snow. And then came the rain. It started in the night, a soft patter on the roof that was a gentle counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. By morning, it was a steady, vertical shimmer, a gray curtain that enclosed their small valley, washing the last of the snow from the high meadows and turning the creek into a lively, chattering thing. The rain was not isolating like the snow had been. It was intimate. It drew the world inward, blurring the edges of the horizon and making the small, warm cabin feel like the only solid place on earth. They spent the day indoors. The relentless demands of the ranch were briefly paused by the weather, granting them a rare day of quiet respite. Jessie sat near the fire, meticulously repairing a piece of leather bridle, the scent of wax and hide mingling with the wood smoke. Clarabelle sat in her own chair on the other side of the hearth, a mending basket at her feet. The needle moved in and out of the fabric of one of his shirts, the small, even stitches a quiet meditation. The only sounds were the soft hiss and pop of the fire, the whisper of her thread through the cloth, the scrape of his awl on the leather, and the steady, soothing drum of the rain on the roof. It was a silence so complete, so peaceful, that it felt like a prayer, in this small, warm space, surrounded by the cleansing sound of the rain. Clarabelle felt a sense of belonging so profound it was a physical sensation, a warmth that spread from her heart to the tips of her fingers. She finished her mending and set the shirt aside. From the small bundle of her belongings, she took out the leather pouch he had given her for her journey. She had used some of the money for the stagecoach, but most of it remained. It felt heavy in her hand, a last link to the transaction that had brought them together, a final debt she needed to settle before she could be truly free. As the afternoon light began to fade, the gray outside deepening to dusk, Jessie set aside his work. He rose and went to the stove, stoking the fire and putting the kettle on to boil. Clarabelle watched him, the easy, familiar way he moved about the cabin that was now their shared space. He was a man of few words, but his actions were a language she had come to understand perfectly. Every steady movement, every quiet gesture, spoke of a deep and constant kindness. He brought 2 mugs to the hearth, the fragrant steam of strong, black tea rising from them. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her cold hands. He sat down in his chair, not across from her, but on the hearthstone nearby, a little closer than usual, as if the rain had drawn them together. They drank their tea in silence, watching the flames dance and weave. The rain continued its soft, relentless drumming. In the quiet intimacy of that moment, Clarabelle knew it was time. She reached down and picked up the leather pouch from the floor beside her. She held it out to him. "I have something for you," she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper above the sound of the rain. He looked from the pouch to her face, a question in his eyes. "It's the rest of the money," she explained, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "From the journey. I kept out what I used for the fare. The rest is here. It's all settled now." She looked at him, her gaze direct, needing him to understand the weight of this final gesture. "So now, I owe you nothing." The words hung in the air, a declaration of independence, a closing of the final ledger of her old life. She was free. She had paid back every cent. Jessie looked at the pouch in her hand. Then his gaze rose to meet hers. There was a profound stillness in his eyes, a depth she felt she could fall into and never touch the bottom. He did not reach for the money. He simply looked at her, and a slow, gentle understanding dawned in his expression. He shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Clarabelle," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that seemed to vibrate in the very air between them. "You never did." The words were so simple, so absolute. Asterisk, you never did. It was not a grand speech, not a passionate declaration, but in that single, quiet phrase, he swept away the entire premise of her shame. It had never been a debt. It had never been a transaction. From the very first moment, his kindness had not been a loan to be repaid, but a gift, freely offered. The money, the room, the safety, it had all been given with no expectation of return. He was telling her that in his eyes. She had never, not for a single moment, been a purchase. The truth of it, the sheer, unvarnished grace of it, was overwhelming. It was a final, gentle breaking of the last chain around her heart. She felt a lightness in her soul, a sense of being truly seen, truly known, for the first time in her life. The leather pouch slipped from her fingers, falling unnoticed to the floor. Words were inadequate. There was nothing she could say that could possibly contain the enormity of what she felt. So she acted. Slowly, she reached out. Her hand, calloused from work but trembling slightly, covered his as it rested on his knee. His hand was large, warm, and solid beneath hers. It was a simple touch, a quiet point of contact in the firelit room. There was no kiss, there was no embrace. There was only this, the silent meeting of their hands, a connection more profound than any passion. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. The world fell away. There was only the sound of the rain, the warmth of the fire, and the look that passed between them, a look as clear and deep as a headwater stream, full of unspoken promises, of a shared past, and of a future just beginning. It was a look of pure, unadorned acceptance. This, she thought, this was the moment. Not that first night in Coldridge, filled with fear and grim bargains. This was her true first night. The first night of a life where she was not an item to be sold or a debt to be paid. The first night that wasn't about a price, but about a presence. The first night that wasn't paid for, only received. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.